Want to build an image gallery that looks really neat? Well, you don't need a framework or an extra NPM package. You can just do it yourself with vanilla HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So let's see how we can do this with just the basics. Let's get started. All right, everyone, if you're new here, my name is James Q. Quick, and I do weekly videos on web development related topics. And I also run a podcast with my co-host, Amy Dutton, called Compressed FM. And those are the images that you'll see in the image gallery that we're going to build today. You can find out more at compressed.fm. Go check out the site. But we're going to build this image gallery with just vanilla HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. We'll have some hover effects that look really neat. We'll have a pop-up that you can click off of to click to view the image really big, and then click off of it to make it go away and see the entire gallery. So let's go ahead and take a look at how we're actually going to do that. All right, so again, here's an example of what we're building. We've got all of our images laid out. This is using CSS Grid, which is really powerful feature of CSS. See, we get these little hover effects to make that bounce a little bit, transition a little bit up, and then we get the shadow that's showing as well. And then lastly, we have this pop-up, and we can click off of this to go back to the full gallery. So again, we're just kind of using the basics here. So one of the things I'm going to do is I've got a web boilerplate extension in VS Code that I created. So I'm going to use that. And actually, I've had some people share that this didn't work for them. So I'd love for you to give it a try and let me know if it works or not. But if you install this extension, then you can run the web boilerplate, create web boilerplate command. What this should do is create an app.css and then a JavaScript file, as well as an index.html. And this index.html should link to both the app CSS and then the app.js, so all of that stuff should be ready to go. So if we put in an h1 here and just say this is going to be our image gallery, the next thing we can do is use the live server extension to view this in a live reloading server in the browser. So I have that extension installed, and I can go to Command-Shift-P, which is the command palette, and then scroll down to open with live server. You can search for this as well. So I'm going to open this up, and you'll see really quickly, this is just going to give us, hey, here's our basic page. And if I were to change this information to be updated or something like that, that's going to refresh in real time so that we're not having to go back and forth and do all this ourselves, which is pretty nice. So let's take a look at the markup. We're not going to have a ton of markup here. We're going to kind of dynamically generate these images. We're going to pull them from an images directory. So here's all the images that I have. You could pull them from like the Unsplash API. You could have images embedded in your project as well. Wherever you want to get them, we're going to kind of read them in and create them with JavaScript is what we're going to do. So inside of our markup, we're going to have a container. So .container here is an emmet abbreviation to do snippets in HTML. And we're going to wrap all of our stuff inside of this container div, or the div with a class of container. Use that div so we can style it here in a minute. Now, the other thing that I almost messed up here is our script should go at the bottom of the body. That way, by the time the script runs, all of the body DOM elements have already been loaded so that we can reference them inside of the script itself. That's really important. So we've got our container here. We've got an h1 for just the title. Then we're going to have a div with an ID of gallery. Now, again, I'm going to use emmet snippets here. So just $, or hashtag for us millennials out there. Hashtag ID, and then enter will generate this div with an ID of ID. That's not what we want. We want an ID of gallery. Hashtag gallery will give us a div with an ID of gallery. Now that thing is just going to be blank because we are going to populate this image gallery with content. So we will just kind of get out of that thing or just leave it there. And then after our container or inside of the container, it doesn't really matter. We're going to create our div with an ID of pop-up now. So this is where when you click on one of the images, it's going to pop up full screen and we'll be able to view the whole image. Inside of there, we'll have an image tag. Now we will have an image tag for each item inside of the gallery, but we'll create that with JavaScript. In this case, the pop-up is just going to be one image tag, and we're going to update its properties dynamically. So we won't set the source. We won't set the alt yet. We'll make sure to. And then ID here will be selected image. Now, if you want a refresher on the emmet's syntax, you can go and look at my video on Introduction to Emmet. It's super helpful. I highly recommend it. It can save you a lot of time. All right, so I think that's all we need in here. I think that's good. Let's hop over to our JavaScript and start to actually add the stuff that we need. So inside of our JavaScript, we're going to need a reference to the gallery. We're going to need a reference to the pop-up, the selected image, and then we'll have a few different properties that we create as well. So let's go ahead and get a reference to those three different things by their ID. Now I have this fancy snippet that I created called get element, or called, the shortcut is get ID. The text is get DOM element by ID. And when I complete this, it's going to stub out all this code where I just then need to type in gallery for the thing that I'm trying to get. So this is going to get a reference to this div with an ID of gallery. And then I'm going to do that a couple more times for pop-up, and then get ID for selected image. Now, if you're watching this, you're probably like, oh, I need that snippet. Yeah, you probably should. So I can show you what that looks like really quickly. So inside of my snippets, inside of javascript.json, here is my get element by ID. So you can pause this, copy this if you want, throw it inside of this javascript.json file for your snippets, and you can use this just the way I do. Cool. So we've got a reference to those things. Another thing that we're going to need is I'm going to create an array of image indexes. Now, the only reason I'm doing this is because I need something to iterate through to show these images. If you're loading images from Unsplash or from an API or something, you don't need to do this. You'll see how we use this in a second. But I'm just going to number these out 9 and 10. There's a little, anyway, those are the image indices that we want to work with. And then lastly, we will select or set our selected index to null. So this is going to be the index of the selected image. Selected image is the DOM element. Selected index is the index of the image that we've chosen from these indices here. So now what we want to do is we want to take our indices, our indexes, and we want to iterate through them to show the image element for each one of those, or to add the image element to the gallery. Because right now our gallery is still, there's nothing there. All right. So we want to be able to display each of those images. So let's take our image indexes. Let's do a for each with an array. And we'll get a reference to each index and just call it I. And in this, we want to get a reference to the image, in my case, that's inside of this images directory. So if I expand this, that's what those look like. So I can say our const image, we'll say take the document, we'll create an element, and this will be an element, an image element. So just like you would, or just the same thing as you would in HTML, now we're creating this in JavaScript. And then we want to update the source to be, and we'll take the /images /cover __episode. This is just the naming convention that I have. And then I want the number dynamically inside of here. So I can put the I and then do .jpeg. So because I use the backticks, that allows me to do variable interpolation with these template literal strings and throw this variable right inside of here. So that means it'll be cover episode 1, cover episode 2, all the way through 10 as I iterate through. Hopefully that makes sense. All right. And then what I want to do is take my gallery and I want to append a child to the gallery, and I want to append this new image. All right, so there I've added on the new image. Now, one thing I could do is, or I should do also, is update the alt. So I could take my alt and I could do something similar to up here. This is the, or let's say cover for episode I of the compressed.fm podcast. All right, so make sure we get our alts inside of those images as well, because I know people in the comments will be like, hey, you didn't add the alt. Yes, very important. So we'll make sure to cover that. All right. And then one of the things I want to do also is give this a list, or excuse me, give it a class. So we'll take our image, we'll say class list, and we'll add on a class of gallery image. So that way we can style those things. And then lastly, we want to create an event listener for each one. So before we add this to the gallery, we'll take our image, we'll add event listener. We will say this is going to be a click event. And then inside of here, what are we going to do? Well, we'll do our pop-up stuff here in a second. So let's take a look at what we got. We've got a reference to a few different DOM elements. We have our array of indices just so we can iterate through them down here. And then we have a selected index that we haven't worked with yet. We created an image for each one of the images that we have in JavaScript. We add it to the gallery, and then we also add an event listener that we'll come back to. Let's save this. Let's see what we got on here. All right, cool. So this is working. It's loading every episode, but we don't have any styling and these images are huge. Now the follow-up video to this will show you how to optimize your images. It'll be out 2 days after this video is released. So when it is, I'll make sure to throw up a card here so you can check it out. It's very important to optimize your images. So you want to make sure you check out that video as well. All right, let's do, since we've at least got this stuff visible, let's open our CSS file and let's start to do a little bit of the styling here. So I like to take my body, do a font family of sans serif. This is not super big deal, but I like getting rid of those tails and having it look a little bit more modern on my text. Then we'll get into our container, and we want this to have a max width of 1600 pixels. We'll give it some padding of 50 pixels and 20 pixels. And then we'll take our margin, do the margin zero auto trick, and that should center this content. So you should see now it has a max width, although the image is going beyond it. We'll fix that in a second. And then we've centered this inside of here, in theory, if the images were working. So let's go to our gallery image. And let's say that the max width is going to be 100%. That should contain that thing inside of its parent. So that works. And then we will set a border radius of 10 pixels. We'll set the position to be relative. We'll set the transformation, or excuse me, transition on a transform to be 250 milliseconds. We'll do the hover effect here in a second. And then we'll set the cursor to be pointer because we're going to allow the user to press on it. So this should make it look a little bit neater. Let's see, did that? Looks like it didn't grab this. Let's make sure we added the right class in here. Gallery image, did we spell that right? Image.classlist.add. Is that the same? It is. Let's do an inspect in here and see if it has the right class on it. So let's select this thing here. Oh, and I think the main thing is this should be border radius. That's what I was actually looking for. There it is. Cool. So that looks good. All right. So we got the individual item. Now we want to kind of put these in a actual grid. So let's take our gallery, and I think this will be an ID instead of a class. So we'll take our gallery and let's do a display of grid. So not really going to do a whole lot for us by default, but if we add a few properties in here, it will get really fancy. Now, what we want to do is have these kind of auto fit the available space, and we want them to have a minimum of 320 pixels wide. So we'll say, hey, we want to fit as many of these on a row as we can, automatically wrap them when we can't, and then each one should be a minimum of 320 pixels with a maximum of just filling up the available space. This is one of my favorite uses of CSS Grid. It's grid template columns. And we can do exactly what I just said. So repeat means we want to do this for each one. We want to auto fit, which means we want them to fit as many as they can and then wrap if not. And then for each one of those items, we want to take a min max of 320 pixels and 1 FR. So we want to repeat for each column. We want to fit as many as we can onto each row. So we'll auto fit. And then each one of those items should be a minimum of 320 pixels with a maximum of 1 FR. So let's take a look at what this looks like. Does that? Cool. So that starts to work. And then we need a little bit of spacing in between. Thankfully with grid, we have grid gap of 20 pixels, and that ought to give them some space and they start to look really good. So those are looking decent. We have the cursor pointer. It's not really clickable yet, or it is, but it doesn't do anything. And then one other thing we can do is add the hover on here. So let's go ahead and add the actual hover. So let's take our gallery image, and then let's add on the hover state. And we want to do a transform. So transform, we want to translate that thing on the y-axis by -2 pixels. So we want it to kind of bump up a little bit. And then when that happens, we'll add not a border radius, but a box shadow. So this will be 3px, 3px, 10px for the spread. And then we'll just do this as black. So let's now see what this looks like. It should give us a little bit of a kind of that bounce hover effect. So remember, we used the transition to time to set it to 250 milliseconds to have that kind of transition in instead of automatically just kind of being there. And I think that's a nice little subtle CSS effect here. All right, so now I think the last thing to do is to do our pop-up. And so we want to go into our pop-up stuff here and start to update what's gonna happen when we click on one of these images. Well, the first thing we wanna do is take our pop-up in CSS, and we want to have this thing take up the entire, well, actually, let's start this way. Let's start in the JavaScript and let's update the selected image. So this thing up here, let's update its source property to be, it's basically going to be the exact same thing as this. All right, so let's just copy that in. So this means that this selected image will kind of be there. And then when we click on an empty image will be there. When we click on one of the images, it should then display that image. So our selected image is probably somewhere down here. If we click on one of these, now you see episode 5, now you see 10, now you see 9. So the selected image is kind of there all the time. What we really want is for that thing to be on top of everything, but only, well, when you view it to be on top of everything, but not when you're not viewing a selected image. All right, let's do a little bit of CSS for this. Let's grab our pop-up, and we want this to be a position of fixed. And because of that, I hate typing this out, so I'm going to copy a little snippet here of setting the top, left, right, and bottom properties to be 0. This means that this pop-up, since it's fixed, will stay in one spot no matter how you scroll, and it will take up the entire width and height of the page because we set, hey, go all the way to the top, all the way to the left, all the way to the right, and all the way to the bottom. All right. We'll set a background color on this to be RGBA, and we'll say 0, 0, 0, and then 0.95. That's basically just going to be black with a little bit of transparency. And then for the actual image itself, we want to center that thing inside of this pop-up. So we can do a display of flex, we can do a justify content center, and then an align item center. Now, anytime you're centering something inside of a div, for example, horizontally and vertically, you can do just this. Display a flex, justify content, which means horizontally center, align items vertically center to get that thing perfectly centered. All right. And then we will do a transform. This may seem a little weird, of translate Y to -100%. That means by default, this thing is going to be translated all the way up to where you're not going to see it at all because we only want to see it when we're actually viewing the image. Come back to that in a second. Then we'll do a transition. This is similar to what we did before of 250 milliseconds on a transform. All right. And then we'll add a padding of 50 px. All right. So let's actually get rid of this transform really quickly. And we should see that this thing hopefully takes up the entire page. We'll also need to set the selected image. So we'll need to grab our selected image element and set its max width to 100% as well. So we'll make sure that that thing fits inside of its parent. There we go. And then notice that this has this little gray or black part on the sides. That's actually the background color of the pop-up. And it's sitting on top of everything at all times, which again is not really what we want. We want this thing to hide itself up above and then come down when we need it. So, all right, I think that is good. Let's go to our transform. Let's add that back in. This thing should disappear. Actually, it's not disappearing all of the way. Oh, and actually, this should be a max height of 100%. So we want this thing to only cover the height that we're giving it. So now that the thing has basically disappeared, if we refresh the page, it's disappeared. There's no selected image. If we select an image, now it's up there. We just don't see it, which means now we want to add a class to the image, or when we show the selected image, we want to change the pop-up for being up above to now in the center of the screen. All right, so let's come into our JavaScript again. And when we click on one of these events, or excuse me, click on one of these images, we want to set the style. So popup.style.transform. We want to transform this thing back to kind of regular 0 for y. So if we take translate y and say 0, now if we refresh the page, we should have nothing. If we click on one, now we see this pop in. Now the other thing we need to do is if we click off of it, we want to make this thing disappear. So we can do that with our popup. So popup.add event listener. We'll take the click event, add in our callback function, and we'll do basically the opposite here. We'll take the transform to be translate y of negative 100%. And then we'll take our popup. Let's do this on 2 lines. Can I do this all at once? Am I smart enough to do this? Nope, I'm not smart enough to do that. All right, so we'll take our popup.source, and we'll set that back to nothing. And then we'll take our popup.alt and set that back to nothing as well. So we're basically getting rid of all the things that we set a second ago. Now, the other thing we want to do is take add this alt again for the pop-up. So we can copy this in for that and just say this is with our selected image. All right, so when we click on an image, we want to slide down the pop-up. We want to add its source to be the image that we just clicked on, and we can set the alt appropriately. And then if we click on the pop-up itself, that means the pop-up is showing, we click on it, we want it to go away. So we translate that thing back up 100%. We set the source or reset the source and the alt back to nothing so that it doesn't have anything in it. All right, let's see what this looks like. We load our gallery, we get an image here. We can click off of it. We can click this one, 4, 8, click on it. And it's got this nice slide effect that looks pretty good. So that was an image gallery with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. But the thing that you will want to know here to watch this next video coming out in a couple days is if we look inside of our network tab, these images are huge. So if we look at what it's loading here, this is loading a 2.6 megabyte image. That's incredibly huge. So in the next video, I'll show you how to do some image optimizations to get this down to under 100 kilobytes instead of 2.6 megabytes. Super, super important. So make sure to come back and check that out. I'll have a card up here for you to check it out when you're ready. Hopefully this made sense. Let me know when's the last time you built something with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. No frameworks, no libraries, just vanilla HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Let me know in the comments below. Thanks as always for watching the video, and I'll catch you in the next one.